I didn't know what their intentions were. My initial thinking was, are they going to kill me?
Peter's been kidnapped.
But it's a fact of life. It's inevitable that some of these hostages will die. Things can and do go wrong.
It was so upsetting that I'd admitted to myself that I was going to die here.
There were times when I contemplated that he wouldn't come out alive. But until you get that definite news, you just have to hope that it's going to be okay.
I was born and bred in Maesteg, a coal mining valley town in Mid Glamorgan, Wales. Lived with my granny and grandpa, my mother and father. Brought up in a large family. Went to Maesteg Grammar School. Left school at 18 after my advanced levels, and joined then Midland Bank.
Like Peter, I was born in Maesteg, went to the local grammar school where we met, and then we started dating when we were about 16. He was just fun to be with. He was my complete opposite, if you like. And we just hit it off, and we just stayed together for years, you know, from 16 till we got married at 23. That was 1968. Just a small family wedding in a registry office.
We had 3 kids together. We lived happily, reasonably happily ever after, I suppose. Then 24 years of marriage, we got divorced and eventually became a bank manager in 4 different branches, and ended up in the corporate banking department. I began to work in other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, and quite frankly, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the culture challenge. I enjoyed meeting new people. Eventually, I was flown out to Tbilisi in Georgia. Beautiful country in many ways. Its scenery and the history that is inherent in Georgia is quite spectacular. Having spent a long time in Georgia, 6 years. The people of Georgia are great, and they are warm and hospitable. They're famous, I think, internationally for what is called a table, which is a sit-down meal. You kill an ox or a goat or a sheep, and then toast their way through a certain format of words and questions by drinking copious amounts of wine and toasting you in turn, every one of which you as the guest have to respond to. They find out more about you than you think you're giving to them, but they discover what they want to know all about you, and they like it. And it's an experience that you have to be able to cope with. And those of us who could do that were wined and dined quite frequently by these people. Lovely way of life in many ways, but very hard. The endemic problem of countries like Georgia is, and certainly was in my time, corruption.
Before he went to work abroad, he came to see me and he said, I'm going to be working abroad. The Foreign Office want a point of contact. My mother's too old, kids are too young. Would you mind being my sort of next of kin? And I said, yes, of course, no problem. And he would tell me then it's a strange country, that you would not believe the corruption. Trying to, you know, keep things straight was a hell of a job. So I knew it was a different culture, a different way of behaving.
There were always reports of people being kidnapped and people who had been beaten up in the main streets of Georgia and Tbilisi. It's just people who want money and they find devious ways of getting it. Corruption is endemic. It's a way of life. It's the kind of social security safety net. They have to pay for everything in return for which they get something.
In the early 2000s, Georgia was a pretty lawless place. It borders Chechnya, and there were many, many groups, many organized criminal gangs looking to make some money by taking Westerners and other people hostage for ransom. And let's not forget, kidnappers, certainly the professional ones, are just businessmen looking to get the best possible deal.
At the end of my 6th year there, I was going home, just prior to the privatization of the bank. It was a normal working day, and I think I was the last to leave the office, as I usually was. But at about 5:30, I walked out, locked the door, and I noticed there was a white minibus parked up the street, just on the right-hand side, which was, I hadn't been there during the course of the day, and for some reason, I just happened to notice it. And jumped into my car, and so I was heading for a party in the city centre. I noticed I'd been followed by the minibus. I thought nothing of it. Eventually, I could see I was a policeman waiting to stop some traffic. As I drew closer to him, he stepped into the road and waved me down. And I stopped and opened the window and said, "What can I do for you, officer?" in English. And he hit me. Three guys dressed in army uniform jumped out of the back of the minibus that had been tailing me, and they held Kalashnikovs and began to fire them into the air. And 2 other guys came to my car and opened the door. I was fighting these guys off. A great deal of noise and pandemonium ensued, fists flailing around, and I was being knocked about a bit. The ladies were screaming and shouting, and the guns were popping. They finally got me out of my front seat and got me into the back seat of the car. And then 2 of these guys sat alongside me in the back seat. One drove the car and headed away from Tbilisi.
But it's a fact of life. It's inevitable that some of these hostages will die. And that could be because they get ill or injured in the abduction or whilst being held captive, or because of some unprofessional behavior or approach or mindset or emotions by the kidnappers. Things can and do go wrong.
About an hour later, we stopped somewhere in the deep country of Georgia. I was taken out of the car, handcuffed, and taken into a little wooded area where they sat me down. The 3 guys dressed in army uniform stood guard, pointing their guns at me and looking down at me. They were all masked. One they called Sasha, who was the leader of the 3, and he sort of posted himself in the entrance to this little wooded area. I was bleeding from the various bits of wounds that they inflicted upon me. My overwhelming emotion at the time of the event was one of anger. I was really pissed off with these guys for this to happen at this stage of my time in Georgia. The enormity of what was happening to me suddenly struck. I realized then that I had been abducted and I was a prisoner. And I didn't know what their intentions were. My initial thinking was, are they going to kill me?
Banker Peter Shaw has been kidnapped in Tbilisi, Georgia.
Command investigation of Peter Shaw case. Diplomats fear for life of banker Peter Shaw abducted in Georgia.
I became very, very frightened. I can recall sitting there. I was shaking, so I was frightened to death. They hoisted me up, and they began to walk me up what was begun as an incline and turned out to be a mountain. And I could recall asking the guy to whom I was handcuffed, what did they intend to do with me? Did they intend to kill me? And he understood some English and said, no, no, no. He said, puli, puli, which is money, money. So I guessed, I realized then that they wanted to demand some money from somewhere. I was all through the night, and eventually we came upon a clearing somewhere near the top of this mountain, on which there had been erected a bivouac, an army tent. They shoved me inside the tent, and they shoved me onto the bunk bed, and The roof of this tent was supported by the boughs of trees and branches of trees that they'd bent to support it from the inside, and they attached the handcuff to one of these tree trunks or tree branches and the other to me, and they began to talk amongst themselves in Georgian. One of them had a transistor radio, which he switched on, and it was a news bulletin. The president of Georgia at that time was Shevardnadze, and he described the fact that I'd been kidnapped. The government of Georgia received a ransom demand of $2 million. The government of the UK would offer a reward to anyone who could provide information leading to my being found and subsequently released. I knew the government of the UK would not pay a ransom demand, probably not the government of Georgia. So, you know, I just thought this was just nonsense. But these three guys who were holding me believed it.
That day I had been out for a meal with a colleague and friend from work, and I got in about 9:45, and the phone was ringing as I got through the door. And it was the Foreign Office, and they'd been trying to contact me for some time, and they said, Peter's been kidnapped. And I said, what? And they said, Peter's been kidnapped in Georgia. He's been attacked and kidnapped. Fortunately, you know, it's through the European Commission. It's not like a third world country, so don't be too worried about it. It'll be sorted. So I then sat and thought, I can't believe this. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to contact Peter's mother. And she used to say, oh, they're not going to hurt him, are they, Maya? I said, no, they want money for him. They'll take care of him. But I had absolutely no idea. All I did know was that he's a strong character with a soft inside, but determined and a fighter. And that was a solace.
We used to have a rule when it came to the families on a kidnapping case. If you lose the families, you lose the case. And what this means is, as a negotiator, as the response consultant, as the advisor on the ground next to them, it was imperative we got them on board. We could never make any promises, but we would reassure them about how this was likely to play out and some of the things that they needed to do and some of the things that they didn't and needed to avoid. For example, not speaking to the media. Even though it's understandable why the family would want to speak to the media and keep the plight of their loved one in the media glare, what that can do is actually raise the perceived value and the profile of the hostage, which would make our job as negotiators far more difficult. And in this particular case, the government officials, people in country, really needed to support and give the family the reassurance and as much detail about what was happening as possible without compromising the operational security that was vital to ensure the negotiation could proceed.
You had the press ringing, you had people knocking the door and asking for quotations and, you know, what can we say? And I haven't heard anything. That was hard to cope with. I was visited by the Assistant Police Commissioner, I believe, and another colleague who came round and told me that the British government clearly do not pay ransom, which I fully understood. And they said, if you were contacted by telephone by the kidnappers, this is what you must do. And I was given a sheet of what to say. And also that sometimes they're not very bright and dial 1471, see if we can get the telephone number back. And I know my phone was bugged. You'd pick up the phone, there'd be weird whirrings and sounds.
We lived about 10 days, I guess, on this mountain top and kept in this tent and allowed to go out for to do my ablutions in the forest and the woods, accompanied or handcuffed to one of them every morning. They were getting edgy. They were losing their patience and beating me up more. They'd offer me water, they would turn out to be vodka. They were taking the piss out of me a lot more than they did initially, and they were getting a bit nasty about it. I tried on one occasion to escape. One of them had gone down the mountain to get some water from a river, I guess, and somebody else was in the tent, and there was only one guy who hadn't handcuffed me to him to look after me. And I saw that there was a Kalashnikov shovel. So as we were approaching the tent, I did a little 10-yard sprint, grabbed the shovel, and the intention was to beat this guy on the head, pinch his Kalashnikov, and run down the mountain. He quickly caught me, this guy quickly caught me, and then suddenly the guy who went into the tent came out, and the two of them grabbed me and gave me a bit of a beating up. It was only one attempt on my part to escape, and I didn't try it again.
There were times when I contemplated that he wouldn't come out alive. But until you get that definite news, you just have to hope that it's going to be okay.
The families are going to experience the whole roller coaster of emotions, almost like the grief process. They're going to be angry and frustrated and sad. And so my job as the negotiator was again to reassure them, to validate where they were at, to make them feel seen and heard. But ultimately, as part of the reassurance, was to give them hope. Even though we could not make any promises, if we could come up with a really good, robust, resilient negotiation strategy, there was a 93% chance of success of the hostages coming back safely.
A few days later, they got me down this mountainside and put me into the boat, and they drove for the whole of that day. There was net out. When it was dark, I didn't have a clue where I was, but a long way from where I'd been. And they began to walk me onto a lane of some sort, and I can recall going past animals. I thought I must be somewhere near a farm. My mask was taken off me. It was a sort of very dark night, wet, raining, and there wasn't anything at all in sight. It was just blackness. So my immediate thought was they're going to shoot me here now and just dump me. And they were lifting up this kind of manhole cover, and one of these guys was going down this ladder. They pushed me down this manhole, and I ended up in this little, well, it was a little room underground, as simple as that, really. It was about 2.5 meters by 2 meters small. It was black, the walls were black. There was a cot, and there was a table adjacent to the cot, and above the table was a hole in the wall. This guy who was down there with me put up the candle and said, light. He pointed to the cot and said, bed. And next to the cot was a bucket, and he pointed to the bucket and said, toiletty. And that's that. He put a chain around my neck, and at the other end of the chain was, he'd padlocked it to something below the cot. And then disappeared up the ladder, and clang, the thing came down, and that was that. I could lie down to sleep, but I couldn't get up. They threw some matches in and a cigarette lighter, and a packet of 5 or 6 Russian cigarettes. And then food. And the food usually took the form of some kind of broth, borscht, or what we would call cawl, mixed with veg and some meat. And I put the plate and the knife and spoons on the sill of the hole in the wall, and then 2 hands would eventually appear and take it away. Now and again, I would talk to the 2 hands, and I would say, when am I going home, in English? And I never got a reply. They threw a candle in, which lasted 40 minutes, almost exactly as a third of a candle. They would go out, and I would be in blackness again. There were chickens above. I was woken up every morning by a cockle crowing. As time went by, it became much colder, much more difficult to cope with the elements. It was an uncomfortable place. I felt this suicidal feeling coming over me. I could do something about it. And I broke down. I remember crying, and when I stopped crying, I vowed to myself never to cry again, because it was so upsetting that I'd admitted to myself that I was going to die here. Initially, I would have a bad panic attack. Whenever I got panicky, I would light the candle and keep it lit for about, I don't know, 5 minutes tops. That would sort of allow me to look around the place and just get my bearings to align myself again with the predicament. They'd given me 2 slips of wire, 2 pieces of wire to hold my trousers up. If a time came when I wasn't able to cope and I couldn't carry on, I could use the wires either to cut my wrist or to cause me to bleed to death somehow, or simply to swallow them and surmise to my being taken out of the hole and giving me the chance to escape. So I kept them. They were my last resort if I had to do something about my inability to cope.
In Peter's case, and in many other cases, the social isolation, the lack of communication with others is also probably one of the hardest things the hostages have to contend with. Because after all, we're social creatures. We thrive on interacting with others. And there are many, many studies now showing that social isolation and segregation and not being able to communicate with other people has long-term detrimental effects on our well-being, on our psychology, on our emotions, and actually physically. Those who are socially isolated tend to die earlier than those who have healthy social connections and communication with others.
It's always on your mind. You go to sleep thinking about it, you wake up thinking about it. You know, putting one foot in front of the other, going to work, coming home, doing the shopping, doing all the familiar, normal things. And then in a quiet moment, you think, oh, I wonder what the heck's going on now, you know.
Over time, and as the hostages held for the weeks turn into months and maybe even turn into years, the family have still got to ride that roller coaster of emotion and, to all intents and purposes, get on with their daily lives, whilst also trying to keep the plight of their loved ones front and center of government officials and the media potentially as well. And so they need lots of resilience and what I call a battle rhythm. I think over time, it's inevitable that the families think the worst case scenario, particularly if they haven't heard anything for weeks or months. They're going to be imagining the worst, and that's understandable.
I thought of my family all the time. It's always there. It's a kind of brooding cloud. You wonder how they're coping. My mother at the time was, I know, in her late 80s and not well, and how she would cope. The kids, I know the kids would cope because they're kids, and they were then in their sort of early 20s, late teens, and quite robust, and they'd mentally manage it. Maya, well, we divorced, but we were still very good friends, and worried about her. You worry about everybody. I couldn't really handle the fact that I was in this place, and during the daytime, my friends and my family would be doing things that they would normally do, like they go to work or they go shopping or whatever. If I could rotate, sleep in the daytime when I knew that they'd be out and about, and I could sleep through that, and then stay awake at night time when I knew they would be in bed, and therefore not thinking about me, and I need not think about them, that would be a brilliant thing to achieve. And I did. I managed to get the timetable in my mind right, and to get that kind of switch. I could counted days by the candles that they threw in, and they fed me twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. My beard had grown very long. Obviously, it was a real long beard. But I would use the candles to burn the beard off. And the water I would pour over my head like a shower. And I imagined that I was having a Monday shower.
Reading the newspapers, and some of the articles weren't exactly positive. There was one article where they suggested that Peter was corrupt. And I knew from the bottom of my heart that that was a load of rubbish, because he's the most honest person I know. But that doesn't help the situation, you know? And then you'd see an article where it said they'd found his belt in the Pankisi Gorge. I knew it was a no-go area for the police. It was quite lawless. And the general consensus in the Foreign Office was that he would be being held in the Pankisi Gorge.
Back in the early 2000s, the Pankisi Gorge was a lawless bandit country on the borders with Chechnya. And at that time, wars raging between different factions, just traveling about, particularly as an expat, as a Westerner, moving around those parts, you were essentially highlighting yourself as being a potential victim of kidnapping, just because of the lawless nature of the area at the time.
I began the habit of choosing a member of my family each day. And the first person I happened to pick upon was my Auntie Shirley. So I would imagine being with her, and I would talk to her. And then quickly I would see an image of her in the same room as myself. And she would talk to me, and that was wonderfully supportive. To me, they were real, and I know that this was not the case, obviously, but to me, they spoke, and I could see them. And that was hugely a significant lot to me.
One of the coping strategies that Peter used, and a lot of hostages, particularly in social isolation, what they utilize is their mindset and actually entering an almost mind palace, so to speak, of being able to imagine conversations with loved ones, to design their dream home or their car or write a book. And to them at the time, it becomes so vivid, it's as if the person they're talking to is right there in front of them. And so for a lot of people, Peter included, this was a key way to stay mentally strong in what was the most traumatic and difficult part of his life.
I had a little band, and I got it into my head that I could pass time transposing some of these jazz standards into different keys and trying to pick on difficult keys to transpose them into. St. Louis Blues, for example, is written in the key of G major, so I try to transpose that into the key of F sharp minor. So I would then use the table, an idea of how I would be playing it. And I transpose, hundreds of pieces of music from the original key into the key that I imagined would be good for it. It took up a lot of time, but it helped.
I am quite an optimistic person. And it was easier to hang on to the idea that, yes, he is alive, than to think about him not being alive and how it would affect the children. And if anybody would cope, I knew it would be him. I knew he would do better than most then.
I heard the clang of the manhole cover, and Sasha came down. He just stared at me for about 2 or 3 minutes. And then he said, "Peter Shaw, you strong man."
And I said, "Sasha, you..." And I meant it, I meant it in the worst possible way. And I don't think that he'd heard the word before, because he didn't react in the way that I thought he would by belting me or whatever. But he unlocked the padlock around my neck, and chains fell off, and I felt a lot lighter. And they dressed me. All my clothes were in rags and covered in to goodness knows what. And they were trying to get a pair of army over trousers onto me and an army flak jacket. And I was trying to help as much as I could, but I couldn't walk. I couldn't mobilize myself. And then they had to get me up the ladder. And there was somebody trying to push me up from below, and somebody trying to pull me up from above. And it must have been, it wasn't at the time at all funny, because I just couldn't move. They got me to the top of the ladder, and I stood. It was black, dark, cold, raining, and I felt like, wow, this is wonderful. I was out of that place, and it was quite an experience, really. And they put me in the back of a car, and Sasha, the leader, drove with the other guy next to me. But he kept on pushing my head down, so I couldn't see through the window. And every time he did, he was shaking. His hand was shaking. He was frightened. And that feeling of, I'm not frightened, but he is. Now, why is he frightened? The car stopped, and they shoved me out. And I didn't care if they were going to shoot me, which I thought they were. And I thought, well, that's all right, that's fine. At least I'm not in that bloody place. And there were 3 or 4 guys with guns, with Kalashnikovs. And then shots rang out.
The strange thing is, most weird feeling came over me, and I can't explain it. And I thought, oh gosh, this is going on and on and on. Will we ever see him again? Will he be badly damaged mentally? I thought if they had found a body, we would have known about it. But until you get that definite news, you just have to hope that it's going to be okay.
Shots were ringing out, and I just dived into the gorse bush at the side of the track. I lay there for a long time after the guns had stopped firing, and crawled around, and I bumped into this chap lying down on the floor. He was making a noise. He was making a groaning sound. And I put my hand on his chest, and his heart was beating, but it stopped. And he was dead, and I thought, what's going on here? But they'd shot him. I just sort of got up and I tried to walk down this path, and I could see what I thought were traffic lights in the distance. They were fireflies. Out of the blue, this voice came out saying, Peter Shaw, are you Peter Shaw? Yes, I'm Peter Shaw. My steak. Anything just to make him know me. My steak. And out of the blue, out of this murk, came these 2 or 3 guys dressed in military uniform, holding these Kalashnikovs, pointing at me. One of them said, you are Peter Shaw. And I said, yes, I know, I'm Peter Shaw. And he grabbed me, he gave me a hug. Just had me. I thought, what's wrong with this guy? There's something going on here. I didn't understand any of this at all. And all they came up to me and they were offering me cigarettes and shaking my hand and patting me on the back. And it's a strange experience. They put me in the back of a Jeep or some kind of military car, and off it went, and it stopped outside this big grey building. I was walked down this path through a door, and it sat me down, and there were dozens of soldiers there, literally scores of soldiers, all buzzing about, talking in a different languages. What the hell they were. And I still assumed I was being captured again by the same gang that Sasha was part of. And I thought, this is not good news. But they sat me down, offered me cigarettes, gave me a cup of coffee, and then I heard this voice speaking English. And I looked up, and it was a minister in the Shevardnadze government for security, for the country's security. And he said, Peter Shaw, we've got you at last. We found you at last. And I said, good God. I looked up and I recognized him. And I knew then I was safe. So I grabbed him and gave him a great big hug and a kiss. Amazing situation. It was quite that feeling of, I'm alive, yeah. Lovely feeling. And I said, look, I don't know what's been going on, but there's a guy down the road who's dead. He said, yes, don't worry, we know, we shot him. And he said, well, we came to find you. We came to rescue you. And all this, rescue me? What? I said, what about my family? Have you told my family? He said, yes, everybody knows. He knew Miles' name. He knew everybody's name. I just, wonderful feeling of, great sensation of relief. Amazing.
I got goose pimples now just thinking about it. My first thought was trust him to escape. But he hadn't. Of course, he'd been rescued. But that was the news that came through.
And within an hour, I was, hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever it was, I was taken into a television studio, and I was stinking. And they wanted me to go on television. And I just wanted to go home or somewhere away from all this nonsense. But they took me in, and I was introduced to various people in the studio, various television presenters and goodness knows what. There were 2 or 3 guys from the UK, the EU delegation, the ambassador's office from the EU, including a chap called Patrick Dobres, Belgian guy who I knew very well. He's a member of the staff of the delegation. And he came up to me and gave me, he's a big guy, he's 4 inches tall, right? He got hold of me, lifted me up and gave me a hug, and I was stinking. And suddenly the whiff of me got into his nostrils, and he deposited me down and he went away. He stood back and, love you to death, Peter. I said, well, you stink. And that kind of thing was going on. But it was a lovely feeling. Elation, pure elation.
This has been a dreadful 6 months for Peter Shaw's family, and the violent deaths of so many kidnapped victims in Georgia in the past did nothing to keep their hopes alive. But tonight it seems that the government there has responded successfully to the huge pressure it was under to find and free Mr. Shaw, to the delight and relief of his loved ones.
Amazed, thrilled.
Delighted, over the moon. It's wonderful news. It's what we've been waiting for such a long time. And now that it's happened, we can't believe it either. All right, lovely.
No, we can't believe it.
Following day, I was allowed to go home.
How do you feel now, and are you going to come back to Georgia ever?
I will certainly come back to Georgia on holiday, yes, but never in a professional sense, and I feel absolutely marvellous.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Well, okay. After all these years, I get still emotional about these things. Very odd.
With the grandson he thought he'd never meet, Peter Shaw looks surprisingly well for a man who's been shackled in a dark hole for 4 months and 3 days. With no company and no sunlight, he counted every one of them.
And I think I was home at Heathrow Airport, and there was Maya and the kids, and well, had a big occasion. Amazing. My grandson is, I hadn't met him before. He was a few weeks or a few months old. He was there. It's lovely. You somehow have to stay alive and survive from day to day, and try and pray, which is not something that I have formed the habit of doing over my 57 years of existence, but I certainly did over the past 5 months.
Just walked in and he walked straight up to me and I put my arms around him and I said, I never thought I was going to see you again. And he said, ditto.
Peter Shaw's back home in Wales tonight, with the authorities seemingly no clearer why he was abducted.
And we don't know who was holding him, and we don't know exactly how his release came about, except what he described. And I must say, he's a lucky man.
I later learned, after I came back, that there were certain ministers involved in organizing my kidnapping. They didn't do the actual kidnapping, but they organized the gang that did eventually do it, because they saw it as being the right time to be able to intervene and to steal the money that the bank, or to manage the bank themselves. The people who were hired just wanted the money, simple as that. They thought they were just doing a job and they get paid for it, and the payment was by way of a ransom demand.
Peter did extremely well to cope whilst he was held hostage, almost so that it's a textbook from which we can all learn from. Starting off with his mindset, he was not going to allow the hostage takers to get inside his mind, even though they could control what happened to him physically. But what he was able to control was his thoughts of his family, his loved ones, and all the plans that he had to do and he wanted to do when he got out. And above all, he had the inner resolve that his dislike, bordering on anger and contempt towards his hostage takers, although it never veered into antagonism really, but that fueled the fire within him, that resolve that he wasn't going to allow it to overwhelm him.
The experience was not one that I would wish to replicate, no way whatsoever. It's a shocking experience, and the people who helped me were nasty. But at the end of the day, I'm still here. And there's been no lasting damage, as far as I could tell anyway, upon my health. I've not suffered from any mental issues because of it. And I got married again, and we've been together for about 9 years now, is it? We keep on going. We're getting old, and we are old together, and it's working. I'm more emotional about the entire thing now than it was then. Then it was, well, this is marvelous. Wow, you know. But now it was just lucky. I was dead jammy to get it to survive it, really.